Cabinet secretaries and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs coming before the House in order to brief us. I think our takeaway is that North Korea is a growing and urgent threat to the region and, frankly, long-term to the United States, and that we have to take some concerted action. We have legislation, as many of you will recall, that we passed in the last session, legislation I authored along with Eliot Engel that would give the administration the ability to bring sanctions on North Korea, but also that advanced into the UN and into the Security Council, and that same concept was passed with the support of Russia and China. So what we're discussing today is the nature of the cooperation, the nature of the threat. I can't give you the information that's classified, but what I will tell you is there's additional legislation which we're going to move very quickly that will also choke off some of the hard currency that this regime uses for its nuclear program. And in particular, it will focus on financial institutions as well as what you might call slave labor. These are cases where the North Koreans send out work crews to do work, and instead of being paid, the money comes back to the North Korean regime and is spent on their nuclear program.
Was there discussion of potential military options in terms of a preemptive strike?
What we are discussing is bringing international diplomacy, financial pressure, and bringing all means to bear, not just on the part of the United States, but on the international community, because we all have the same interests here. So we're discussing cooperation with China, we're discussing cooperation with our other friends and allies in the region, and we're discussing how we choke off the financial means, which we did once before in 2006, 2005. If you recall the crisis then, we caught North Korea counterfeiting $100 bills. And at that point in time, with Banco Delta Asia sanctions and sanctions on other financial institutions, we choked off the money needed for their military program. The dictator couldn't pay his generals and, more importantly, could not continue to build out his missile program. Those are the types of options we are looking at.
Chairman, that strategy sounds pretty similar to the Obama administration strategy. In what ways do you see the new strategy differing?
What's different is doing what we did do in 2005, where we actually did sanction financial institutions and prevent them from transferring the money. And so in this particular case, you actually have ongoing discussions that we're having with financial institutions and with the international community where we're reaching the same conclusion. This is why the UN Security Council passed that legislation. Now there's some additional things that also are coming into the conversation, and we're going to be talking about this next week in the committee. But this afternoon, we had meetings with North Korean defectors who are increasingly engaged in broadcasting on shortwave inside North Korea. And the response has been a very effective one in terms of having North Koreans begin to understand what their countrymen are telling them. These are people with the pulse on the society there because they were raised under these conditions. And building out a program that would also give them a voice in explaining the reason why people are starving in North Korea and how this cult is being used by the dictator on this weapon system instead of support for his people. This is another issue that puts a lot of pressure on the regime. I thank you all for the chance to explain a little bit about what we are going to do next week in the Foreign Affairs Committee and in the weeks ahead. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, some senators were saying, some senators indicated that they thought.
Hello, I'm Brad Sherman. I'm the second ranking Democrat on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I generally agree with Chairman Royce's program and especially efforts to designate North Korea as a state sponsor of terror. That being said, at the classified briefing, the Vice President asked members of Congress to step forward and to describe the administration's level of resolve to confront North Korea. I regard that level of resolve as very modest, weak, maybe even phony. The only way to put enough pressure on North Korea is to get China to do it. The only way to get China to do it is to put pressure on China, because they see the survival of that regime as very important. They do not see the current situation as untenable, and we are unwilling to even threaten China with tariffs. Therefore, our very modest pressure on China means that Wall Street wins. China will therefore put very modest pressure on North Korea. That means Kim Jong-un wins. We have a program of trying to accomplish a great deal while doing very little, and certainly nothing that would annoy Wall Street. Finally, I raised two issues. One is that North Korea might smuggle a nuclear weapon into the United States rather than use ICBMs. A nuclear weapon will fit inside a bale of marijuana. That issue was not really addressed. And the second is that North Korea might sell a nuclear weapon for billions of dollars in hard currency. Fortunately, ISIS doesn't have billions of dollars of hard currency, but Iran does. I'll take any questions.
Was the briefing pretty open to questions? Was any member able to ask questions?
Oh, yes. Most of the briefing was a matter of members asking questions.
It wasn't
As are
open
most.
to committee heads or anything?
No. I'm second ranking on foreign affairs, but the reason I got to ask my questions is because I sat near the microphone, not because of how long I've served on the committee.
Can you clarify what you meant about the Vice President? The Vice President asked other members.
The Vice President gave introductory remarks, and he called upon members of Congress to convey to the public, to our districts, just how strongly the administration was dedicated to dealing with this problem. And I want to convey to you how strongly they are dedicated. They are dedicated to a modest, weak, and phony degree.
Did anyone push back to the Vice President when he made that?
No, the Vice President left before questions began, but I think many of us have wanted to do things as far as pressuring China that would aggravate Wall Street, and Trump has been unwilling to do that.
When you say he has members to step forward, like he physically...
He didn't say put your left foot and then down your right. He said he asked members to convey to the public,
Oh, I see.
to convey to our many contacts with foreign governments, to convey to our districts, to convey to those, I think he used the phrase even beyond our districts, the level of resolve that the administration has. And I'm doing that right now by telling you that level of resolve is very weak.
Did that leave you with the impression that this was just sort of a very large photo op for them?
No, I think they were there to brief us, but what was lost in the discussion is they're unwilling to do anything that would put real pressure on China or use our ability to impose tariffs, because these are things that Wall Street would reject.
Did they suggest any new sanctions were in the works or were imminent in any way?
Nothing that would contradict what I just said.
Any discussion of preemptive military options? Or?
I'll decline to comment on that.
Any discussion of relisting North Korea as a state sponsor of
I believe there was some discussion of that.
did they indicate that they would be doing that anytime soon? Or?
There's no timeline there. It is a matter of public record that this is under review,
Right.
that the standards are tough, that it requires more than one act of international terrorism. But in addition to killing his half-brother, I'll point out that the North Korean regime engaged in cyber terrorism against Sony Pictures and decades ago seized Japanese civilians and force those civilians to teach the North Koreans etiquette, Japanese etiquette, in order to help their spying operations in Japan. That is a continuing act of terrorism. When you kidnap somebody, it's not just a terrorist act on the day you kidnap them. It's a terrorist act on every day you don't release them. Those Japanese civilians have not been released. So there's three major acts of international terrorism. I think North Korea should have been designated a long time ago. You know that they were taken off the list in return for promises they never complied with. So clearly they should be on the list. But that's my own comment. It no timeline was given. Thank you very much.
Just a couple on the subject of North Korea. I think to the degree there is a diplomatic key to resolution of the threat that North Korea poses, both in terms of their improvements to their ballistic missile program as well as their efforts to miniaturize a nuclear weapon and marry the two technologies. If there is a diplomatic path, it runs through China. And I think the approach we need to take with China is to impress upon China that we are going to have to take steps to protect ourselves and our allies in the absence of more vigorous action by China to rein in their neighbor. China still has the most economic leverage it can bring to bear. China doesn't have a complete say-so in what North Korea does. And I'm sure that China has its own frustrations and concerns about North Korea. But nonetheless, I think the pattern has been the Chinese imposition of stronger sanctions, China clamping down on coal exports and energy transactions when the pressure is on, when the focus is on, and when the focus dissipates, the Chinese effort dissipates along with it. Obviously, China has their own red lines in terms of not wanting a collapse of the North Korean regime and a unified peninsula under a Western-friendly government with U.S. troops effectively brought to their border. But nonetheless, a lot more that China can do, and I think we need to impress upon China that there are steps that we will have to take in the absence of more effective Chinese action that would increase our naval presence in the region, that would increase our anti-missile presence in the region, and that it will be necessary to implement secondary sanctions. And I think that we are at the point where we need to start utilizing that very powerful financial tool as we did with Iran. But I would advise the administration to be very careful about any miscalculation. We're dealing with an erratic regime, a young, inexperienced leader who murders members of his own family. And I think the best approach for the administration is to bring maximum pressure to bear diplomatically on China as well as North Korea, but otherwise to walk softly and carry a big stick.
What did you think of the briefing itself, and how much confidence do you have in the briefers?
I thought it was a good briefing. I thought they addressed the questions members had in a thoughtful way. They certainly had a grasp of the issues that we were discussing. I don't want to go into any of the contents of it, but I think, unlike a lot of the briefings that we have that are contentious or where you can divine some kind of a party divide, that was not the case here. I think all the members were serious, and as were the briefers. There wasn't any kind of division or dispute among members, and I think the presenters answered the questions in a very matter-of-fact way.
Do you have confidence in those top briefers, people like Rex Tillerson?
Well, I think that the president has some very capable people surrounding him. I certainly think that General Mattis is among them. General McMaster is another. But they're obviously working out a lot of challenges within the national security infrastructure of the White House and the NSC. And there have been no shortage of mishaps, including the whole misdirection of the fleet or of the public as to where the fleet was headed. But in any event, I think it was a productive and important briefing.
Did you learn anything new, any major revelations from any of the information you got today?
We received, I think, quite an in-depth briefing from an intel perspective on the Intelligence Committee, so that part of what they discussed was not new, but certainly getting a more fulsome briefing on the diplomatic approaches that are underway, I think was valuable for all the members, including the members of the Intelligence Committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Affairs Committee. I thought that the briefing was a good briefing. I thought it was thorough. Members on both sides engaged. I've attended many briefings where I've left and thought, gee, I didn't really learn much. I felt I learned something here. And we showed unity. There was no, as someone said before, no difference between parties. Individual members asked individual questions. They were all interesting questions and, of course, all concerned the threat of North Korea. It's no secret that North Korea remains a threat. It's no secret that a military option against North Korea would be just about unthinkable because of the devastation it would cause all throughout the peninsula. And so we've got to try to see what we can do to resolve this diplomatically. And as some of my colleagues have mentioned, so vulnerable. That's why we cannot really talk about military strikes cavalierly, because it wouldn't take much to do severe damage, obviously, to Seoul and other places in South Korea. So I think we're in the talking stages now, and we're hoping that China will understand and does understand that they have as much of a stake in this as we do, and if it's dangerous for us and the rest of the world, it's certainly dangerous for them.
Mr. Engel,
yeah.
Some of your Democratic colleagues seem to be critical that the administration isn't putting enough pressure on China. What specifically do you think the Trump administration should be asking the Chinese to do?
Well, you know that North Korea has a lot of its trade go through China. You have the Chinese influence in a lot of things in the border there, and I think that North Korea understands that if the Chinese are serious about sanctions or making it harder for them, they certainly have the ability to do so. I mean, that's why they're the only country, in my opinion, that really has an influence over North Korea. And, you know, we have to make the Chinese understand that this isn't really just our fight, it's their fight and the world's fight. To have a North Korean regime with nuclear weapons threatening its neighbors is not only a problem for us, it's a problem for them, maybe even more so for them because they're right in the area. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.